Hey everyone, welcome back to this chess channel. Today I have a really special game. So this game is not between two human players like we normally look at. This game is actually between AlphaZero and Stockfish, two of the top engines in the world. And this was even closer to their peak. This was a game back from 2017. This was from December of their match. And in this game, what really impressed me, what probably makes this my favorite computer game, is that AlphaZero played very, very human-like. It looks almost like a Grandmaster. Obviously, it's much higher rated, but we'll see how it beats Stockfish. And I actually wasn't so sure about having this little bar up here because this is Stockfish evaluating Stockfish, and also, the real, Stockfish is much higher version than the chess.com one. So this bar may or may not be too accurate, but we're going to leave it up for now. Okay, so as the game starts, we have knight f3, continues knight f6. All this is solid so far. We have c4, b6, d4, e6, and this looks pretty normal. This looks like something you'd get in a lot of games. Oftentimes, beginner players will start with e4 or d4 because that's what they're taught to start with. But knight f3 is also a very solid move to play on move 1. Also the English opening, c4. So all this is pretty solid stuff from opening theory. In fact, one thing that really impressed me this game was just how far these engines actually followed opening theory. It's actually kind of nice when you see top grandmasters in the world study these openings, sometimes for centuries because of how old chess is, and then computers evaluate things and they realize pretty much the same conclusion. So I think that's actually kind of cool that computers and humans actually agree on generally most things. So we have g3, which is still solid, and now we have a move that looks a little bit more strange to some people. This is bishop to a6, but this is also completely well-known opening theory, played many, many times before. This is known as the Nimzowitsch variation, and so this is a very solid approach that Stockfish has chosen to play against AlphaZero. And, perhaps because of this loss that, AlphaZero does win this game, later in the match, Stockfish started changing opening, trying for things like bishop to b7 instead of bishop to a6. But nevertheless, this is still a fine opening. So their opening choice was all right so far. We have queen to c2. And, we really want to get into a lot of this analysis, as we're going to see soon, because, c5 is normal, but then here we have d5. And d5, to the untrained eye, it looks like it's maybe losing material, because the problem is, it's like, how do you save this pawn? You're going to have e captures, and you really can't capture back and then capture back with the knight, because that's how you would try and maintain your material balance. But the problem is that's actually a mistake, because if you take here, if c takes and the knight takes back, what's going to happen is you have queen e4 check, and now this knight here, this knight has to move, and they're also in check, so, they're going to lose a knight, or they can try and bring the knight back, but then if they bring the knight back, now they lose the rook in the corner. So this is actually well-known opening theory still, and so that wasn't possible. So how do they actually save the pawn? This is a really cool thing. One of the things I really like about this game, again, is just how human-like they played. Generally, computers are very precise, very accurate. They don't give up anything. They count centipawns, 1/100th of a pawn. They don't like sacrificing. They're just very systematic and trade things down. It's an engine. It can see really far. One thing that's really impressive here is these computers were analyzing over 120 million chess positions every second. And Stockfish was thinking on an average of 2 minutes for every move during this entire game, which is just crazy. Like, how can it not solve chess, after thinking that deeply about things? But it's just that chess is so many combinations, so many possibilities of chess moves and positions. Even if you can analyze 120 million positions a second, you're still not going to solve chess. It's just a drop in the bucket to how really vast this game is. So, okay, so obviously here, what did happen? Well, the answer is, back to the human approach, they don't get the pawn back. This is a genuine pawn sacrifice. It's a positional sacrifice, which is a thing that humans would do. Generally speaking, computers don't really do these things too often. So it's kind of nice to see a computer playing a positional sacrifice. So what's going to happen is we're going to have, obviously, c captures, but you don't capture back. And so what's going to happen here is we'll play bishop to b7, and the game will kind of continue normally here. But if they, go with this, type of position, oftentimes they'll have some kind of play as white on the open files, some kind of compensation. So, they have some things, for this position. It's not just a very weak pawn, white has a lot of play for it, as we'll soon see. So we have bishop to g2, which is just normal. They're just trying to get castled. Now we have knight to captures d5. We have castles. Knight c6, just developing. All this is solid developing moves, looking good so far. Now we have rook to d1. All pretty logical here. Obviously black is going to do the same. They want to get castled as well, so they're going to bring out their bishop. Bishop to e7 is the chosen move. And all of this is still opening theory. According to my chess opening database here, even though white is slightly better as far as how they score in this opening, I will say there is quite a bit of a high draw margin, I think. But as we know from, this really nice AlphaZero game, this game is not going to end in a draw. So we have queen to f5, which is just a nice move. Of course, you couldn't have taken this knight before. That's a common thing to look at. If white were to try and take this knight, they're not actually ones grabbing material. It's actually black who is. Because if you take this knight, you're actually going to lose the rook, because this knight is moved. It's a discovered attack here. And we're also attacking the queen. So white is going to have to move their queen somewhere, probably like to c3. And then white is probably just going to take the rook. And, we'll be losing a rook, and we only got a minor piece there. So that's no good. So we have queen to f5 instead. Putting pressure on this knight. This queen is pretty active, maybe looking at the king side somehow. And there's a lot of potential ideas. So they have to address the knight right away. So they move the knight back to f6. We have pawn e4. g6 trying to kick away the queen. Queen moves back to f4. Now black castles. Good opening principles. Both sides are playing super solid still. Pawn to e5. Now we have the knight moves away to h5 here. And now queen to g4. And we're still surprisingly in opening theory after 15 moves. It was only until this next move that we actually varied. Stockfish here chose rook to e8, which is an interesting move. But perhaps maybe a little bit better. Maybe we could consider something like queen b8, which looks strange, but we're just adding more pressure to this central pawn. So that would be one possibility if you didn't want to play rook to e8. Now, giving another possibility, something interesting that could have been chosen as well, was a different game, because again, it's all been opening theory, played many times before by many top players. A really interesting variation, I think, was knight back to g7. You might get knight c3, and then this knight can relocate to e6. And this position here, in this variation, this was actually played from the white pieces by Grandmaster Anish Giri, and from the black pieces, it was Grandmaster Judith Polgar. This was a casual online game back from 2009, and that game was drawn by agreement after 36 moves. So again, it's got a high draw margin, I think, in this opening. But, white has good positional compensation for the one pawn that Stockfish is currently in the lead. But okay, none of that happened. We have rook to e8 instead. So now we have knight c3, just developing. Now we have queen b8, which is the same idea that we mentioned earlier, trying to put more pressure on this central pawn. We have knight to d5, white playing very actively, of course. And so black actually chose to go back with bishop to f8. Now, you might wonder, well, we were putting pressure on this pawn. Can we take this pawn? Because it's only defended once, and it's attacked twice by these pieces. And the answer to that is no, you can't. If you do try and take this pawn, that's also a mistake, because here you actually have an in-between move. After you capture, you have this in-between check, knight captures e7, and it's with check, so they have to answer this move. But when they answer it, say recapture back this way, now the bishop can capture this piece on b7. And so because of all the discoveries and exchanges, it's actually now AlphaZero who will be up material, when previously it was Stockfish who was up a pawn. So, they don't want to give up 2 points of material, so they move the bishop back to f8. So white continues, we play bishop to f4, and I really like this move a lot, because as we'll see, AlphaZero is playing very, very human-like. Oftentimes computers don't play logical-looking things to how a human would see it, and here, for pretty much the rest of the game, white is going to be exploiting the weak dark squares, specifically around the king here. All of these, maybe even h8 you could argue, all of these squares are going to be very weak. And if you want to extend the center of the board, even d6 is actually fairly weak. This is fairly simple once it's pointed out, but you might wonder, why are we giving up this, bishop here? Because couldn't white just take this bishop? And, you would think if you want to exploit the dark squares, you want to keep your dark square bishop on the board, right? Well, that's actually the really interesting thing why I like this move so much. You can actually put this bishop here, and they actually can't take it, because what happens is, if they do try and take it, then you have knight to f6 check, and the king is going to move, and then you can just recapture back. But now you have really nice plans of just trying to relocate your queen somewhere here, get to the, checkmate. And if they try and block this, maybe something like h5, you can actually change strategy. Now you can bring this other knight in. So there's just so many threats here. Don't forget this knight can also attack this pawn too. So it's really, really difficult to try and guard all these dark squared problems. So the bishop puts itself here, where it could be taken, but, obviously Stockfish calculates all this and shouldn't take it. So of course it sees all that and it just plays queen to c8, realizing it can't take it. Just wanted to step out of this pin, because if it didn't, maybe this pawn could have been pushed, maybe some kind of discovered attacks, so they had to be a little careful there. So the game continues. Now we have pawn to h3. We have knight e7, trying to maybe contest this knight. That was a pretty active piece in the position. We have knight back to e3. We have bishop to c6. And now we have rook d6, which I really like a lot, because this is actually a key idea, where I've seen this a few places before, but it's very rare to see a computer do this. I mean, this is the first time I've actually seen a computer do a move like this when I first saw this game. So it was really cool. The idea here is we're actually blocking black from developing, because the move they really want to play is moving this d-pawn. They really want to play d6 or especially d5. If they can play that, say if they were to get d5 on the board, they could really help contest the center. Then they would help their development. This queen could maybe get out, a lot of ideas that way. Oftentimes there will be a bishop here instead, and you have the same idea where you don't want this bishop to get developed, and this queen is blocking, or sorry, this bishop, in this case the queen, but in the other position a bishop, and you don't want it to get out. And so it would have to get out by moving this pawn, so you can actually block that pawn with one of your pieces. So this is actually kind of annoying for black, because they would really want to push this pawn, but they can't, because now they've blocked it. So, of course, black has to do something else. So they bring this knight back. Maybe they can try and, contest, this square in the long term, something like that, if white does nothing. But, of course, AlphaZero anticipates all this, and so they move the rook again. Now we have rook to f6. Really cool idea. It's the same idea here, where this pawn can't move. And it's kind of funny that we had this rook come in this way, slide over this way, but black is completely tied down here. White has a really nice space advantage. White is going to make really good use of these dark squares. This bishop might come in, the queen might come in at some point, maybe even ideas like h4, h5. It's just a really nice position, and it's really difficult for Stockfish playing black to hold on to this, even though they are actually up material, because they're just behind in development. White is very close to having all their pieces in the game. As soon as you get this a1 rook into the game, you're set. You've got really everything going for you. But here, black has this rook still out of play. This queen is kind of inactive, back in the back rank, probably doesn't belong there. Ideally, they would like to have their rooks connected. That way they're coordinated, protecting each other. And even these knights, they're not really the most active pieces. And certainly this bishop is not doing too much back on f8. So white really has a nice position. And what's also really cool about this rook move here is this maneuver from d6 to f6. It looks kind of clumsy at first sight, because it's just the way that it moved is kind of awkward. It's like, it's so deep in black's camp, it's the heart of the enemy position, really. But ironically, somehow, some way, paradoxically, if you look, this rook is really hard to move. Like, where could black play to try and dislodge this rook? Like, it's actually really difficult. Like, you don't want to go here because, this is a trade, so that's no good. And it's like, what other moves are there? You don't really want to come back, do you? And it's very difficult to move this rook. And if this rook is keeping this pawn stuck, here, then they're fixed with all these dark squared problems. So AlphaZero is playing a really human-looking approach. Computers generally don't play this. It's really cool to see this, in my opinion. But okay, they have to play something, so they play queen to b7. Now we have bishop h6, again, trying to make use of these dark squares. All these squares here are weak. This bishop on h6 is now just adding pressure to all these squares. So really good logical stuff here. Now we have knight d5, which I did mention here, and we do get this trade, just as anticipated. But now white will bring their last attacking piece into the game. Now we have rook to d1, and white is fully developed. So we have knight to e6, trying to bring this piece back into the game. Wasn't really doing a ton on g7, it's just doing defensive work. And this is actually really cool because at this moment in the actual game, the higher version of Stockfish, it was only now that Stockfish started realizing it was in trouble. Previously in the game, in the match, Stockfish was thinking it was roughly equal with AlphaZero, and it's only now in its evaluation that Stockfish at that higher depth was starting to realize that actually this position is about +1 in white's favor, according to Stockfish. If you use the chess.com analysis here, this quick review, it makes it look like it's 0.0. Even here, Stockfish thinks that, it's actually hanging on. But if you run really deeply, like a supercomputer, like what these were using, you'll start to see the bar go a little bit more up, and you'll realize white actually has a slight advantage here. So we do trade bishops, which, again, to the human might seem a bit counterintuitive because you would think you would want the bishop on the board if you're trying to exploit these dark squares. But what's really cool about this position is that when they recapture, even though the bishops have been traded off, these dark squares are still weak. And so what do you actually do here? It's very difficult to guard these squares now that the black dark square bishop has been traded off. And yeah, white has lost theirs as well, but we have constant attacking pressure. We can go with the same h4, h5 that I mentioned. We might have some kind of queen over, maybe knight, setting up some kind of checkmate. You can't do it straight away, of course, because, this knight is guarding this square, so we can't just jump into g5 right away. But, maybe the defender will get removed. Maybe we'll sacrifice this way, set this up, and have checkmate at some point. So white definitely has many ideas to try and continue, but for black, they're just going to try and hang on here. And even though they're up a pawn, they're basically on the defensive. And generally, you don't want to be doing that. So here we have queen h4, targeting this pawn, and of course the weakened dark squares. Again, we might have knight to g5 at some point if it's allowed. We have bishop back to c6, probably trying to make room for the d5 push, which is really the key, for black to try and liberate their position. That's the same concept that we had when we had the rook on d6, trying to block that pawn. Well, now that the rook has moved to f6, this pawn is free to move. So that's a nice little benefit for black. But they still have to defend the attack, and here we have queen to h6. Again, they're just infiltrating the position. I mean, at least from a human perspective, this would look kind of scary, I think, if you're playing as black. I mean, you see these pieces near your king. You're safe for now, but even Stockfish, can't hold on forever here. So they have rook a to e8, and now we have rook to d6, which, to me, this just looks so funny. It's really comical looking, but it's like, this is so strong because you have this nice space advantage, and you just tie black down. They can't advance any of these pawns. So how are they contesting the space? They really can't. And how do you fight for these weakened dark squares? And you really can't either. And so we can just see how, tied down black is, even already. It's to no surprise if we get some kind of Zeus-Vong position where literally just black has no moves and they're just tied down to defending. So here, they have to do something to this move. So they play bishop captures f3. We have this recapture, and now queen to a6. And this is a really nice thing here because, as white, you would maybe think, well, what about this pawn? Who cares about it? A grandmaster would be like, we have this huge attack on the king side here. It's more important to continue your attack. Some people, they'll worry about this pawn. But this is on the complete other side of the board. Losing a pawn only really matters if you don't get to checkmate. If you checkmate the king, it doesn't matter how many points are down. And so I think the really key move here is to play h4, which is exactly what AlphaZero comes up with. And it's a very human thing. You just keep advancing this pawn, you keep opening lines, and eventually you're going to get to this king. Much more important than trying to randomly move this pawn or try and guard it somehow. Now, one other move I'll show, which was also something to take a look at, is h4. I think it was really the only way to continue. But if you use the chess.com quick analysis or some kind of weaker version of Stockfish, it's actually going to say rook captures d7. And I actually don't like that move too much because I think here, they realize Stockfish playing black, they're up a pawn, and the computer really wants to equalize material and just take this pawn back. And then it's equal and it's a regular game. But the problem is I think this might even be a positional mistake because if you take this, pawn, now you're allowing like rook to d8. And now black has some counterplay. Black has some ideas. Before, if we don't take this pawn, they're just tied down to defense. Like, what is this rook doing? What is this rook doing? Even this queen seems misplaced on the queen side. The only really good defender is this knight. And, this one knight is only guarding this square, really. Maybe this, you could argue. It's very difficult for them to, fend off an entire white army, when black only has one piece defending their king. So I think it's much better that you don't take this pawn and you don't give black adequate counterplay. Now, to show one thing here is if you were to take this, I think it's not so great. The problem is, of course, rook to d8. And, one line could, not straight away, of course, but one line to show what could happen is if they do play it straight away, you just capture on f7, they take, you take back, and when they recapture, you're just basically overstretching their defenses. You can try and block the check, but now e6 check is coming, and you really just can't hang on to everything. You're just getting stretched apart, and eventually white is just crashing through in their attack. So you can't really take this pawn because of this move right away. But for black, I think if this had happened, like if white had captured on d7, I think black can try and prepare this move. I don't think you play it right away. And eventually they'll be able to help contest the d-file, and maybe they have some counterattack here. Also don't forget that there might be some checks from the queen. Maybe the queen could come to one of these squares, maybe give some kind of check here. This bishop isn't always going to be on f3 perhaps. So these are ideas that I'm sure if you're calculating 120 million moves a second, you see these kind of ideas. So with that being said, AlphaZero did not go for this. It played, I think, a much more human approach, which was don't take the free pawn, don't allow counterplay, just keep playing with their attack. And h4 is a great move here. We're just helping to support our attack, open up lines, we'll have a really nice attacking position. So black does play queen to a5. Now there's actually a real threat here. Black is actually threatening this check. King is going to have to move, probably to g2, and then black is going to pick up this pawn. And so white really doesn't want to drop a pawn here. And so they just play the prophylactic rook back to d1, which, temporarily does free this pawn, but we didn't want to drop material in the process. So it's a useful move to bring the rook back. Here we have pawn to c4. Now rook to d5. And it's a little bit different here, because now if black gives the check, as they did, now the king can go to g2, but now this pawn is also defended. It's now defended by the rook. So here, they're not winning a pawn, and, one could argue the king is actually safer now on g2 than where it was previously back on g1. So you might even think that this check might have actually helped white slightly, or at the very least, black hasn't really accomplished much by giving this check. So, okay, now we have c3, which this is where it kind of looks computerish, and I think you really see, Stockfish looking like a computer and AlphaZero looking a lot more human-like. Because if you go back here, a human player, they realize that, this position is bad, you're on the defensive here. But a computer is looking only at the material mostly and saying, well, Stockfish is up a pawn, I'm tied down, well, I can play here, and, I don't really mind, if I lose this pawn back, so what? Because they're up a pawn, and it's like, maybe they can hang on with other engines like that, but a computer as strong as AlphaZero with this human-like play and all this precision is probably going to be able to hang on here. I mean, it looks like it just gives up a pawn, but the problem is if you don't push this pawn, what do you come up with? It's like it's very difficult to find a move. Like maybe you could try like rook to e7 or something, but that's still defensive. You're still passively defending this pawn. Maybe this queen could relocate somewhere, but there's not really that many great squares. It almost seems like black just has to sit here while white has all the fun. They have potential to open up lines. They have potential to keep the attack coming. They have all these pieces active. One might even say the bishop could get active very soon. It's just white has all the play here. So, they do play c3. They capture. We capture back. It's black. And now we have h5. Just continuing the attack. Very systematic here. But it's also very human-like. You had a plan and you go through with it. Generally speaking, computers don't have the same plan look that they have. It's really interesting to me to see AlphaZero playing in this very human-like fashion. So we do have the rook e7, which I alluded to earlier. And, there isn't really many good moves. You're just passively defending this pawn. It's not really that this move is great. It's just that rook e7 is kind of the best they have, really. You have to move something. And so now AlphaZero, they have all the time in the world. They just slowly improve their position. And their only piece that's really not in the attack is this bishop. And so now they start a plan to relocate this bishop to d1, possibly to c2 or b3. And, from those squares, it's just going to start attacking the king side. If it was on b3, it'd look this way. If it was on c2, it'd look this way. And either one, you're going to have a lot more attacking pressure. And the bishop's just one extra attacker that white will have to crash through on the king side. So they have bishop to d1. We have queen to e1 now. And they chose b3, which is a good square. You're looking directly at the king through all the x-ray of all these pieces here. But, for potential tactics, perhaps a pin, maybe a discovered attack, these are all nice ideas to have. Just more things that Stockfish has to look out for trying to defend this position. So we have rook to d8, trying to get behind this pawn. Maybe at some point they can push this pawn. Can't do it right now because the rook is here. Also en passant, if they do advance. But if eventually some point this pawn is free to move, it would be nice to have a rook behind it. With the Tarrasch rule, you generally want rooks behind your pawns. So that's what they played. Now we have white playing rook back to f3. Black plays queen to e4, pinning this rook. So that way they can't move it here. So we have queen to d2, a little bit of relocating here. And even though it looks like black is making progress because white's pieces have retreated back a little bit, they're not as close to the king. The problem is these dark squares are still weak. And even though the pieces aren't directly there, they're just shuffling around their pieces in a systematic way. And black still really can't stop this. How do you prevent these lines from opening up? It's not really too easy. And it's not like you can just come back, because if you try and come back, here, it's just, you've weakened your position more because now this pawn is advanced. Now this pawn might be weak. How do you defend? You can't defend this way because, we'll just take. If you defend this way, well, now you've, released control of this square, and so every time you advance a pawn, you have more and more weaknesses in your, position. So, of course, you really don't want to do that. You really can't stop the position from opening up. You have to play something. And I think one move, which is worth looking at, is knight to c5. But I think even that move doesn't work. Because if you do play knight to c5, I'll show a sample line what happens if you do play this. It's just going to go take, you'll take back. Again, we have the open h-file. And then you'll go something like queen g5. And already you're looking at these rooks. You're going to have to do something like defend the rook. And now we have a really cool idea. We have rook to d4. And this is just really nice. The whole point is that the queen is going to move. The rook is going to come to h4 here. This queen is going to go to f6, and then you're just threatening checkmate. And this is very, very difficult here. You really can't hang on to all this. Now, if they were to try and take this rook, you can actually take here is one possibility because the pin, that pawn can't take, of course, because this bishop here. And you just see how, black's king is in very, very major danger here. You just give this check over here. They might move. Now you can bring the bishop back. And, you're very soon getting checkmated here. So that's no good. Instead of taking the rook, you could try and go for an endgame. You could try and capture e5. But the problem there, in addition to this same move that we looked at, that pin is still there. Queen could still capture safely this way. That's a problem. But even if it wasn't for that, even if you do trade down, say you take this queen, you trade, you're not reaching a safe endgame with black because there's this move. And once you fork these pieces, white is going to be up, with the material going to the endgame. And there's no way that Stockfish is going to hold this. Not against the strong play from AlphaZero. So, with all that being said, it didn't go that way. So, after queen back here, now we have the queen g4 move instead of the knight c5. Really not too many moves available. We have bishop to d1, queen back to e4. Again, we're just kind of shuffling with black at this point. And now we push h6. You don't even open up lines. Now we just have extra threats of, possibly bringing the queen in. If the queen would end up here at some point, that could be checkmate. Of course, this knight is guarding that square right now. And, we're not that close to the queen. You'd have to, shuffle in this way. And there's many pieces along the way that could stop that. But it's just one extra thing that black has to worry about. And notice they can't push this pawn. Once h6 is pushed here, now how do you free this pawn? You just can't stop all these dark squares from being exploited. So it's a very tough positional grind to sit through, But we have knight c7, trying to hang on, trying to relocate. And again, we see the same thematic idea. Now we play rook d6, again, blocking this pawn. keeping them from developing. We have knight back to e7. That's, good as try as any, I suppose. One thing that's worth noting is you could not take this pawn, because if you had taken it with the rook here, for example, queen, same idea, but if you take with the rook, you actually end up with back rank problems, because white can take on d7, and if you trade, taking back here, you can try and kick the queen away, but we're still going to give a check regardless, and when you try and block, now we can just overload your defenses. We'll just play bishop to a4 here, and you can't take this bishop, because if you take the bishop, you lose the rook. And so how do you defend this? It's just very difficult, because this knight is pinned, and now it's being overloaded, and you still have the same back rank problems. Don't forget, if they somehow win this back rank, the king can't come up because of the pawn. And so you might very easily get checkmated here. There's just too much pressure. You can't hold all this. If you try and push the pawn, for example, you could actually come to c6. And if the bishop gets to c6, you're going to move the queen. And then you'll probably put even more pressure this way, and you're still x-raying f7. And there's just no way to hold all this. It's just really undefensible. And notice again, this h6 pawn, pushing and not opening the line, is controlling a very useful square. Keeps the king boxed in. So all of this was, possible ideas, be looking at. I'm sure these engines were calculating this. But instead, they didn't take that pawn. They went knight to e6. Now we have queen back to b3, again, putting more pressure, looking on the same line as the king. And now we have queen captures e5. It's like, okay, now Stockfish is up 2 pawns. They were up by 1, up by 2, but material doesn't really matter. They're still so passive, so defensive, and, so what? 1 or 2 pawns doesn't really matter. Again, computers don't generally sacrifice like that. So for AlphaZero playing white to play this really positional sacrifice, it just looks really human-like. And I think it's really cool that computers are starting to get to that level. So now we have rook to d5. Queen has to come back somewhere. It's going to go back to h8, as funny as that looks. And so now white plays queen to b4. Of course, we're looking at this rook, so that's a move, right there you have to watch out for. Black tried to play the interference move, knight to c5, because they really didn't want to move this rook. If you move it, then that's one less defender of this pawn. And this pawn was already under enough pressure, so the interference is probably best. Try and save e7 that way. Now, what's also really cool here, another sacrifice. You could go from your Gotham chess Levy memes. They sacrificed the rook. But really, it's a really nice positional sacrifice, because when you take this, this is the only really good defender here. These rooks, again, are stuck tied down, to this pawn. This queen is really out of play. It doesn't really matter that black is up a little material. White can still sacrifice, because when they take this, it's a genuine pawn set. Not pawn. It's an exchange. You're genuinely sacrificing. You're not even taking it back, because here, this c5 pawn doesn't mean much. It's just one pawn, and it's not really relevant. So far out of play. It has nothing to do with this kingside attack. It's actually more important than capturing this pawn is just move your queen to the kingside. And so queen h4 is the move that was chosen. Just a genuine sacrifice here. And now you're looking at both of these rooks. And so, of course, they're going to have to defend this. And so you double the rooks, try and keep things connected. But now we have really powerful move. Maybe the best move of the game, I think, which is rook to f6. And it's just such a simple idea. It's the same idea as before, where this pawn cannot advance. But in addition to that, we're also cutting off the queen. And so at the cost of a piece that's worth 5 points, the rook, we are cutting off the 9-point queen. And so, it's very easy to see how, even though Stockfish playing black is up material here, their pieces are tied down so much, and they're just on the defensive. And now their queen is literally out of play. So if you factor all that in, material's a lot closer to equal. But because black is so defensive here, they just can't keep everything, held together. So they play, rook to f8 here. We have a queen f4, adding more pressure to f7 square. And now they just start pushing pawns, because everything else is tied down. Like, black can't really shuffle. There's really nothing to do. This rook probably has to keep guarding this pawn at some point. This rook is guarding f7, just like this rook here is. And this queen can't move. This king is stuck. It's just really a really hopeless position. I don't even know how else to describe it. It's just, you get to a point where things look so bad. So they pushed a5. What else do you do? We have g4, just advancing. We have d5, but again, this is just a lesson in Zugzwang. Like, if this isn't a lesson in that, then what is? Like, the definition of Zugzwang, German for compulsion to move, it just means one side literally has no good moves. And that's exactly what we have here. Black just has no good moves available. So they pretty much are forced to just push pawns. There's really no moves left available. So, of course, we just take the pawn as white, recovering a little bit of material. Material that didn't really matter much. It's the fact that black is tied down that's really costing them. So they move the rook, and then we have bishop back to c4. Push another pawn. We have g5. And the reason they're advancing this pawn is just to fix the weaknesses. Now these pawns are, supported. These pawns are, fixed. All of them. These two fixed by these two. And then this one here is fixed because of the rook. And all of these can't move. And, black really just has no moves. They're, like, forced to push a pawn again. And eventually they'll run out of moves when they run out of pawn moves, like they have here. So now we just have queen to f3. They don't have any pawns left. They have to move a piece. So they go rook to c7. We capture this. They try and sacrifice their queen out of desperation because there's really no other moves available to them, really. They capture back, of course. Rook f to c8. Just doubling. Why not? We have queen d3, and, again, AlphaZero behind the whole game. I mean, they're up material now that the queen was gone, but, I mean, the position hasn't changed. Black is still on the defensive. They have to guard this pawn. Otherwise there might be some kind of battery ideas like this. There might be some kind of checkmate ideas on the king. Maybe a back rank idea, because don't forget the square is still controlled, this time by 2 pawns. So it's just really bad. Resignation's pretty close, I'm sure. We have queen to d6. They move the rook again. And now white is a4, and at this point Stockfish had enough. And so here Stockfish resigned as black, and AlphaZero won a really nice game. The obvious threat is, of course, you're just going to push this pawn, and black is still tied down to defense. You really can't stop everything. There's really no way you're going to stop this pass pawn. So at that, Stockfish finally had enough and resigned the game. But I thought it was a really cool game to analyze. I'm glad to share it with everyone. It's just something that, you don't see too often. Computers, generally speaking, are very systematic, very exact in their play. They don't like giving up anything. Very rare you'll see them sacrifice unless it's somehow there's a tactic behind it. But as we saw in this game, there were many positional sacrifices that AlphaZero played. And perhaps it was that and many other human-like reasons that AlphaZero was able to outplay Stockfish at a very high level. So I hope everyone found this game as interesting as I have, and I will see you in the next video.